and welcome to another episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where the First World War meets popular culture. In this episode, we will discuss public history and how it is communicated. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me are Jessica Meyer, Chris Kempshall, and we are very pleased to have with us Greg Jenner. Greg is the host and creator of the chart-topping, award-winning BBC podcast You're Dead to Me, author of numerous history books for adults and children, and the historical consultant to 9 series of the BBC's multiple award-winning TV comedy series, Horrible Histories. Welcome, Greg. I hadn't actually appreciated there was 9 series, and I think there's still more of them, isn't there?
There's still more. Yeah, they're still going. My colleagues are still working on the show. I left it in 2019. But my friends are still making the show, and they're still doing great stuff. And sometimes I see clips pop up, and I'm like, "Oh, yeah, that's good." Well done.
It's funny because it's one of those things that just seems to be about everywhere. It's a bit like, the BBC made in the Night Garden for kids telly in 2000, and it's still on 25 years later. Horrible Histories is a bit like that. It's kind of still on. My daughter, at the end of her school day, they would finish with Horrible Histories. But I wonder if our starting point is how did you become a public historian, author and broadcaster? Is that what you set out to do?
How long have you got? I wanted to be an academic, so I wanted to be a historian in a university setting, classic sort of researching and teaching job, the standard model that I think most historians sort of aim at when they're probably coming up. The long and the short of it, and I hope this is not in any way kind of stepping on anyone else's toes, as far as I know, I was the first person to use public history or public historian in the UK as a sort of job title. And I may not be the first. Of all of my sort of colleagues, friends, people in the sort of public history community I sort of hang out with and chat with and so on, I think I was the first to use it. And funny enough, the reason I chose it is because I didn't feel comfortable with the term historian. I didn't feel fully qualified. I only had a master's. I couldn't afford my PhD. I'd planned to go to the States to do my PhD, and I couldn't make it work because I'd borrowed money to do my master's and had to pay back that money. And so I got stuck in a kind of loop of like, well, I can't do that because I can't do this. So I ended up in telly. I love TV, I love movies, I love comedy, I love music. I'm very kind of pop culture is my thing. And so I wanted to teach and I wanted to be a historian, but I went where the most number of people congregate, which at the time in 2005, do you remember those glory days? It was television back then. These days, TV is not even in the top 3, probably most consumed media for historical content. But back then, that's what it was. So I went into making documentaries on television. I moved across into historical dramas, which was really interesting. And then by pure happen chance, pure luck, I was in the building when I heard my boss, Richard, at Line TV, say they'd got the rights to Horrible Histories. And I sort of doorstepped him. I was very sort of shy and awkward. I'm still fairly awkward, but I was, I'm a lot more I'm more comfortable now, I guess, sort of putting myself forward for things. But at the time I was, really, really shy. But I just had this sort of moment in my brain of saying, oh, this could be it. This could be the opportunity. Because for me, history is my career, but comedy is sort of my passion, if that makes sense. So I adore history and I think about it all the time and it's my job and that's what I've decided to dedicate my life towards. But what do I do for fun is I watch comedy. And what did I do when I was 15, 16? I wrote comedy and I'm a historian who loves jokes. I love comedy intellectually too. My PhD would have been on comedy in Chaucer and 13th century medieval romance. So I would have written my PhD on how does comedy work in a medieval literary setting. And so joke writing was something I was doing at university. It was something I was studying at university. And when I went into TV, I thought, oh, that went behind me. And I thought, oh, well, that's a shame that, that was a nice little window, but that's gone now. I need to earn a living. And then suddenly there was this thing dangled in front of me. Well, it wasn't even dangled in front of me. It was dangled over there. But I could see it swinging, at the other end of a room. And so I sort of ran up and knocked on Richard's door and said, I'm so sorry, I've been eavesdropping on your phone call, which I really shouldn't have done. But I've just heard you've got the rights to Horrible Histories. I don't know if you know this, but I love comedy. I'm obsessed with comedy. I wrote my master's thesis on Monty Python's Holy Grail. I know how this works. I know how jokes work. And also I'm a trained historian and I think about this stuff really hard. My master's thesis was about historical accuracy in popular entertainment and whether this thing matters. Please let me work on this show in any capacity. I'll make the tea. I'll do the photocopying. I'll hoover the office. Just please let me be near this thing. And Richard went, oh, yeah. Oh, we weren't going to have a historian on the show. I guess maybe it would be useful to have someone with some historical training on the team. Yeah, go on then. And so I sort of took my way into a job that didn't exist. He took me upstairs literally 10 minutes later and said, right, there you go. That's Caroline Norris. That's Dominic Brigstock. That's Giles Pilbrow. These are the creative comedy geniuses behind lots and lots of great comedy shows that you love on the TV. They're going to be making this show. I guess you should just sit next to them now and figure out horrible histories. And so I had this incredibly weird Tuesday where I was making a documentary at one point, and then 10 minutes later, I was suddenly working on this experimental comedy show about the past for children. And we very quickly realized we didn't know what we were doing because we had to invent a new genre of television called factual sketch comedy, which does not exist. You know, we had to literally come up with it ourselves. And that was a hugely exciting endeavor, but also really hard work. Series 1 was an enormous experiment, and I thought it would die on the vine. I thought it would come out and fizzle away, and I'd go back to making documentaries. And of course, it became a huge, huge hit and has won a vast number of awards, which is very exciting. And, you know, it's BAFTAs and Emmys and all sorts of things. And I did that for 11 years. And then I had a bit of a mental health crisis. I was sort of very poorly, decided I couldn't work in TV anymore because of the stress, decided to become a writer, you know, got a book deal, and then sort of ended up on TV doing a thing briefly, my first ever sort of TV presenting gig. And then suddenly I was like, oh no, I think I'm doing this now. And I found myself doing that, and I couldn't figure out what to call myself. Long and the short of it is that I wasn't comfortable with historian. And I went looking for a job title that encompassed my weird skill set and my lack of knowledge, but my breadth of knowledge, in that I'm very comfortable in every era in history for about 10 minutes. And then I run out of facts, and I found public history. And I thought, yes, that's me. And so I became, I think, the first person in the UK, probably that I'm aware of, to use the term public historian. Mostly because I was too shy, I felt too inadequate and too awkward to say, I'm a historian. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. And then over time, I came to sort of feel much more proud to use it and much more confident. And I decided, you know, I tried to fill out a kind of criteria of what I was doing and what I was trying to achieve and what it was I was aiming for and what could I do with that as a career that became a positive endeavor that actually, that I was putting something useful out there. And so then I found a purpose behind the term public historian that I was comfortable with. And now that's how I describe myself. That's a very long story. I'm so sorry.
What's interesting about that is, I mean, as I'm sure you're aware, that universities have become incredibly interested in the term public history. They're not very good at defining what public history is, but they're interested in the concept of public history.
So I'm very lucky that I get to do a little bit of teaching now. So I get to sort of fulfill my little ambition, you know, sort of a couple of times a year at York University and Royal Holloway, University of London, on the master's course in public history. And that's really fun because obviously I get to pretend to be an academic for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. But also I get to meet these amazing, brilliant, talented master students, some of whom I end up recruiting to come work with me on stuff. Or we've done internships. I've hired some of them, and, you know, it's been really nice. But what's really lovely, when I wrote my master's thesis at York, and I loved my time at York, it's a wonderful university and a great city, and I had a great, great time. But when I wrote my master's thesis on medieval movies about King Arthur, they sort of stared at me and went, "What are you doing? What? You know, like you're meant to study Chaucer, not movies about Chaucer. Like what is this? You know, this is the Centre for Medieval Studies, not the Centre for Movies about the medieval period." So they didn't know what to do with me, and they had to convene a special panel to mark my master's thesis because they were like, we don't know what to do with this. You're sort of outside the limitations of what a medievalist is meant to do because you're studying how medieval history is consumed, but you're not necessarily studying medieval history. And I was like, yeah, but I think it's really important. I think this is how people think about the medieval past. I think we have to think about that. And I think we have to study it critically. And I wasn't the first, of course. There are lots of great scholars who've been writing books about movies about the past. But I think I was a slightly awkward fit. Every time I wrote an essay about Chaucer, I would be name dropping The Simpsons, and they'd be saying, "What are you doing?" Chaucer he didn't know The Simpsons. And I'd be like, I know, but I know The Simpsons and it's helping me understand Chaucer. And they would be like, well, that's not how this works. But I'd say, I think it is. I think comedy is a universal algorithm that when you apply it externally to things, you find patterns that still work. And I think someone who's grown up on The Simpsons will find jokes in Chaucer that you may not have found if you don't already understand the rhythms of 21st century comedy. But there was a tension there. And I love my time at York. And what's been so lovely is being welcomed back to the department, being allowed to teach there, and of them saying, great, actually, yeah, we agree. Your point that you made when you were 21 years old, we didn't quite get it. And now we get it. And it's like, cool. Thank you. I'm really grateful. So that for me has been a really lovely journey that I think I feel like maybe at 21, 22, I was trying to figure out, where do I fit in this? Because I could have easily just been a medieval historian and just worked on Chaucer. But my passion kept drawing me towards, but why is this such an enormous subset of our culture, of popular culture? Why do we keep making movies about the past? Why do we keep playing video games about the past? Why do we keep writing songs about the past? Why are we so interested in history as a territory to explore creatively? Why can't we let go of it? And who owns it? Whose is it? Is it historians?
I think you've just given the justification for this podcast. I mean, we have a particular historical period in the First World War, but between us, we cover, detective fiction and video games. And, we've had people on asking exactly those questions about all sorts of different cultural forms. So, thank you for articulating that.
As somebody who works on computer games and Star Wars, I'd like to say I sympathise with the feeling that people don't get it or care.
But I had a question about medium, because you said earlier that you started in television, and television is not now among the top 3 most consumed media for history. Do you know what the top 3 are and why? And can you talk about the shift? Because I know you've shifted from television into audio.
It's a really good point. I think there is a prestige to the TV documentary that hasn't faded. So if someone is given that sort of position, I think we all go, ooh, well done, excellent, congratulations. It's still great to see a historian on TV on BBC Two striding through a field and pointing at a castle. But, behind me, Henry VIII, set forth from, it's great. But the truth is that quite a lot of British TV channels are making less history than they used to. Indeed, there are fewer channels where you can go as a public historian to make history on television. So it used to be BBC Four was the amazing training ground for a whole generation of brilliant public historians who learned their craft doing that and then graduated over to BBC Two and even BBC One. It doesn't exist now, really. It's now an archive channel. So they just show stuff that was made before, but they're not making anything new. So it's a real shame. ITV barely does history at all. Channel 5 used to do lots. They're doing less these days. Channel 4, I went to a briefing at Channel 4 where they said, okay, so our definition of history is anything that happened in the 20th century. And we went, right. And they went, no, that's it. And maybe that was just a short 6-month window where that's what they were looking for, but they were not interested in anything pre-20th century. I sort of stared in bewilderment but that's all of history until what, do we just get going in 1901 and go, all right, here we go, history, let's go. And that's not to say Channel 4 are wrong. It's just potentially they looked at their data, they looked at their advertising revenue, they knew that they were maybe hurtling towards the most devastating financial crash in the TV industry coming. The past 18 months have been devastating in the TV industry for loads of my friends and colleagues. It's been the worst it has ever been in the whole sector. So it's really hard times. But you've also got a massive demographic shift, and you've got a huge technological shift. So Jessica, your question, where have people gone instead, right? So the most consumed would be probably video games, because a hit game that deals with a historical period can have vast numbers of plays and downloads and communities spawning. So you've got your kind of Total Wars and your Age of Empires, which are kind of classic games, but obviously you've got modern games and Assassin's Creed and things like that, which are global behemoth games that just are beyond the reach. You've obviously got a massive shift in terms of where history's gone and into social media. So the TikTokification of history is enormous right now. Instagram is a massive place for people doing short history kind of content. You know, they would call themselves content creators. They might call themselves public historians, but that is where a huge number of people are doing it. YouTube, you know, you'll find YouTube sort of celebs, people on there with huge followings in the millions, doing sometimes incredibly detailed, sometimes incredibly well-made stuff. And you go, oh, well done. That's very impressive. And sometimes absolute nonsense, you know, really kind of dangerous conspiracy theory bullshit. But YouTube is an incredibly interesting platform right now. It's sort of deregulated. It's very much a sort of Wild West. But there is good stuff on there, and there's also dangerous stuff on there. And the algorithm, of course, drives you to the next thing that's similar. So if you like one thing, then you get, here are 57 other things just like it. So you can very quickly fall down a rabbit hole into that, which captures you, and you become a YouTube consumer. So you're not really out there anymore. And then, of course, podcast has grown hugely. So I host a show called You're Dead to Me. And yeah, we're on both Radio 4 and podcast. So we are making two versions of the show. One goes out as a 57-minute podcast, and that goes out on RSS feeds, and it goes out on BBC Sounds, and it goes around the world, and we get, you know, really good numbers for that. And then, of course, the show gets cut down to 30 minutes, and it goes out on Radio 4 on Saturday mornings. And then you're getting another 1.5 million people listening on top of that. So broadly speaking, whenever we do an episode, at least 2 million people are hearing it, which you would murder your granny to get those ratings in TV now. You would sell a limb to get that. I mean, when I started in TV, 2 million was like, oh, it's a bit, all right, it's a bit disappointing, but okay, all right.
BBC Two, isn't it?
You know, if Time Watch got 2 million, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's fine, I guess. Now, if you get 2 million people to watch a history documentary, you've completed life. You can retire. Well done. So that's really interesting. But the obvious other thing, just very quick to finish my point, and I know I'm ranting, but like historical drama has had an explosion of popularity in the span of my career. And so we are also seeing that history now is moving away from specialist factual. It's moving away from historian in a field. And now we're seeing a huge number of people engaging with history through creative interpretations, which are either on screen or, of course, fiction. So, you know, the novel, the historical novel, which has always been there, of course. It's not a new thing, but there's a massive market for it and people love it. And so the Bridgertons of this world, their reach is astonishing. And I don't know if you've spoken to Hannah Gregg, who's a fantastic historian. I don't know if you know Hannah.
I do. I've been trying to get her to come and speak to our PhD students for a number of years now. Just the timing's never worked.
Well, she's fab and she's wonderful and she's lovely and she's kind and she's funny and she's incredible. Like when you look at her CV, you go, wow, you've worked on an Oscar-winning movie. And Hannah sort of single-handedly has sort of conquered the 18th century on screen and has done Poldark and Bridgerton and The Favourite and all sorts of really big hit shows. And when Bridgerton came out, the data on it was beyond calculation. Like the number of people who saw Bridgerton episode 1, series 1 was in the tens of millions. And you sort of go, that, what? What do you even mean? Like tens of millions? I don't understand what you're saying. It's a whole other paradigm. So when I say TV is not in the top 3 anymore, it is, but it's not documentary.
It's like You're Dead to Me proves how big actually the history market can be still. But what's interesting about like what You're Dead to Me is it's much more academic than I think the listener really understands. You've kind of subverted what seems like let me tell you a narrative about high heels and actually give them a discussion on gender and power. But the listener won't have necessarily signed up to listen to that, but have got to the end of it and sort of taken it all in and enjoyed it. And it actually demonstrates that actually the listener is probably more sophisticated than I think people, possibly commissioning editors, would ever originally admit to, because they were slaves to perceived numbers.
So when I came up with the show format, I really, as I said before, I sort of had an anxiety about where do I sit in the kind of hierarchy is not the word, because that sounds like a sort of, there's a power struggle going on. But where do I sit in the landscape of historians doing important work, and what can I contribute? I knew that my skill set that makes me different is that I'm funny for a historian. which is not the same as funny. Funny is someone who can get on stage and be funny is a comedian. I'm funny, brackets, for a historian, close brackets, which is a sort of devastating knife wound to my ego, but at the same time is absolutely true, right? I simply wouldn't make it as a comedian. I'm friends with loads of comedians and I know how much funnier they are than I am. But I am able to, through years of exposure to comedy writing, years of exposure to comedy projects, working on stuff as a writer, as a consultant, spending time with comedians, playing football with comedians, hanging out with comedians, whatever. I know how they think and I understand how jokes work. And I'm sort of able to keep up. So it's not that I'm funny enough to sort of set the agenda, but I can, it's like a peloton, right? I can cycle along with them. I wanted to create a show that harnessed the two things I love most and also the two things I'm best at. And what am I best at? I'm best at making complicated things simple, and I'm best at making serious things funny. Those are my two skills. And it's taken me years to master them, and I wouldn't say I'm brilliant at them, but I think I'm competent at them. I think I can do them to a sort of competent level where you don't go, oh God, this was terrible. And You're Dead to Me, I tried to come up with a format that would harness those two things. And the first format I came up with was one comedian, two historians, and me. And it didn't work. The balance was off. There were too many nerds in the room. The comedian was outnumbered. There wasn't parity of esteem. You're sending a message when you outnumber the person who's there to be funny. When you outnumber them, they are told your contribution's not as important. We're surrounding you. It's like the Battle of Cannae. We're going to flank you and encircle you and destroy you from within. We're saying the history here is what matters, and you're here to sort of pepper it with a few jokes. So we did a pilot. It didn't really work. It wasn't bad audio. It wasn't bad radio. Like, you learn plenty of stuff. But what happens is psychologically the comedian starts to try being a historian. It's very hard to say, well, I'm going to keep fighting my corner. Instead, the comedian goes, well, I'm clever. I know things. I've read books. And they start going, yeah, well, I think you'll find actually. And suddenly no one's doing jokes. And so when I came up with a format for You're Dead to Me, I was really, really trying to have a dialectic. What I really wanted was two historians who argued, me as host, comedian there to be funny. And it didn't work. The structural failing with You're Dead to Me is that we don't have a second person to push back. That is the tension in the show. So what we try and do is pick experts who are going to be honest enough to sort of say, this is what I think, or they might be able to put both sides of an argument and we can then sort of talk it through. But you don't have the second dialectical kind of counter argument. I really wanted that. But what I really, really wanted was a comedian there who's not just going to do stupid jokes. I wanted every episode to be a comedian genuinely curious, genuinely interested, taken by surprise at how interested they are, suddenly going, hang on a sec, what? Hang on, what? You said, I didn't know. And the pitch line that I always tell people is, what would a historian and a comedian chat about if they got delayed in an airport lounge and their flight was cancelled and they had 3 hours to spend and they sat next to each other and said, what do you do? Comedian, what do you do? Historian, oh yeah. What are they going to chat about? That's what You're Dead to Me is meant to be. It's meant to be an organic conversation between two strangers who find they've got something in common. And of course, that doesn't happen naturally. You do have to engineer that. We do script. The historian, I have a script, but the comedian doesn't have a script. They don't even know anything other than the title of the episode. That's all they get told. It's a really high wire act. It takes tons and tons of research, loads and loads. We have a whole team of researchers who are PhD students. My colleagues, Emma and Emmy, are both. Well, Emmy's got a PhD. Emma's just finishing a PhD. I'm the least qualified member of the team with only a master's. And we are a kind of gang of nerds who build these scripts with tons of research. We've written 1.5 million words of research notes over the past 6 years. We've got 500,000 words of scripts. And then you throw comedians into it. Then you get the comedians to react. But what you're looking for is someone who's going to organically be fascinated and excited and interested and surprised. And the reason it works, and I'm so proud of the format because it proves my point, is that comedy and history are not oppositional. They intersect so easily because comedians and historians are so similar. And I figured that out years ago by spending time with both. But comedians and historians are both the person who goes, hang on a second, really? Why? I don't trust it. Really? No, hang on. Pull on this thread. Keep pulling on this thread. Keep pulling on that. Yeah, look, it goes over here now. Look. And that's what comedians are like. Comedians do that out loud And historians do that in their own mind, and they write it all down, and they say, but it's the same mindset. I don't trust what you're telling me. Let's go figure out, is this true? Oh, look, here's some tension. Here's something we don't know. Here's a kind of a gap in our evidence. Here's a struggle here. How can I work around this? Comedians do that comedically, and historians do that intellectually. Put them together, and you have hopefully a really good conversation where the comedian is learning, and thus so is the listener. The comedian is the proxy. They are asking the questions the listener wants to ask. And hopefully they're also being funny. They're also being joyous and silly and, chucking in some gags. But if they're not learning anything, we failed.
I did have a question about making serious topics funny. And of course, we are a First World War podcast. And this war in particular is one of those that constantly gets labeled with it was brutal and depressing. And the social media reaction every time you say you do the First World War is, oh, wasn't it terrible? Oh, the pity of war, as the response to that war. And I know you have made wars funny. I know you haven't particularly made the First World War funny necessarily, although there are some sketches that we looked at from Horrible Histories. What do you do where, superficially at least, the topic is so difficult to think of in terms of humour? Potentially.
It's such an interesting question. And my amazing producer on Horrible Histories, Caroline Norris, a brilliant woman, really funny, very thoughtful, not a trained historian, but, was really, really open to me, and gave me, I was 25 years old when I got that job. And I had an enormous amount of research sort of that I had to do. And the whole kind of, I was the research team. So it was just me for 5 years. But she was so amazing at just going, I trust you. You tell me what we can and can't say, and we'll figure out how to be funny. And that was incredible generosity from her. But the thing she said was really interesting is that tragedy plus time equals comedy. And we sort of realized, intriguingly enough, there was a clock on it, and the clock was 100 years. Anything older than 100 years feels safe. You can do gags about it. Anything more recent than 100 years, everyone is very sensitive, because there is a memorial sort of legacy of, that's my granddad. There's a sort of like, it doesn't take long before the family photos get whipped out and suddenly here's a photo of someone. My grandfather fought in the Second World War. My great grandparents fought in the First World War. I have photos of both, or all three of them rather. I've got their medals. And I know the trauma. My grandfather had a traumatic time in World War II, and it affected him the rest of his life. I know one of my great-grandfathers was very proud of his time in the war, and one of them threw away his medal. He was so disgusted and so ashamed. That in itself is like, ugh, okay. And I'm half French, and on the French side of my family were Jewish. And in World War II, being Jewish in France, unfortunately, was a death sentence. So I also lost family at Auschwitz. So I am really aware of the pain of war and the horror of war and the bleakness, the brutality. And so it's really hard to be funny about that stuff, because your default position is, oh God, in no way is there humor in here. It was comedy. But of course, you go and look at, well, I mean, I'm telling you, well, have you looked at First World War sources, any of you? But, without wishing to teach you the basics of the First World War, like, they were funny. I mean, the Wipers Times or the Ypres Times or whatever name it was going by that week is funny. These are soldiers who, is it Nottinghamshire Regiment? I can't remember, but they find a printing press and they just start churning out a newspaper. It's full of gags. And you've got stuff that we would do in Horrible Histories. I think, if I remember rightly, there's a sort of like a lettings agency like advert, or there's a kind of like property advert saying, no man's land. It's, delightful, and the idea of doing a sort of satirical sketch about, you're waking every morning being shelled and your friends are getting shot in the head and you're being gassed and you've got trench foot and there are rats running around you. And the first instinct is like, right, lads, we're going to write a satirical piece this morning. Who's going to give me 300 words on the Brigadier General and his knobbly knees? And it's an amazing human response to trauma, to go, right, well, we need to find a way through this. And the way we found through this is we're going to do jokes. We're going to sing songs. Bertie's going to get dressed up as a pantomime dame and she's going to sing songs. And it's really amazing to see it. And you realize that the human condition processes grief and trauma and horror in numerous ways. And one of those ways is jokes. One of my best mates is a doctor, and he's got an incredibly bleak sense of humor. And sometimes I'm like, you shouldn't be allowed to be a doctor. But his sense of humor is because he's a doctor. He's seen everything. He has desperately tried to save people's lives. He has been in road traffic accidents on site as a first responder. He's seen the worst that can happen to a human body. He's seen the worst that can happen to a human family when he has to break the news. And his response then is, okay, and how am I going to protect myself from this? I'm going to distance myself by laughing at some of these things. And he's not doing it because he's not sensitive. Of course he cares. Of course it matters. Of course it's serious. But that's how he's going to get through his week, is by doing really bleak jokes that make me go, you can't say that. And so I think comedy is not an inappropriate response to tragedy. But the question is, who gets to do it?
I suppose the interesting thing is that when you become familiar with First World War humor, which, as someone who's worked on trench journals, hospital journals, these spaces where the jokes happen, it's not all bleak and black humor. And I was amused you mentioned the getting dressed up as a pantomime dame. We have a tradition on this podcast of cross-dressing, men cross-dressing. There are lots of men cross-dressing in the First World War. It is subversion of the order in a world where order has been upended that I think is a huge release for a lot of men. So it's not just about being... It's not just black humor. It never is, which I find fascinating.
And there's a comfort to it, isn't there? I think if you've grown up your whole life surrounded by women, girls, mothers, teachers, carers, sisters, siblings, cousins, friends, whoever you've spent time with and you've enjoyed their company, and then they are entirely absent for 3 years and you are in a trench surrounded only by blokes who stink, you might want to restore them to your life in any way you can. So I don't know.
They're not entirely absent.
Well, okay,
yes.
sure, yeah. But whether there's maybe it's that pantomime tradition, maybe it's just that you're just transferring over.
Well, what's interesting is it cuts across cultures. It's not just lots of British men doing it. And which was the film that we watched where the joke was that
it's the French film with the British cross-dressing. The prisoners of war, aren't they?
Yes. And they do a series of nationality-based jokes, and the joke is that the British cross-dress. But actually there are French and Russian and German traditions of cross-dressing as well, which are quite funny.
That's really interesting, isn't it? But also, I mean, as a historian of celebrity culture, one of the people I wrote about in my book was Vesta Tilley, who sent men off to the trenches. She was a recruiter, right? And so she was a star of the stage, a female performer who did drag acts as a variety of male characters, including soldiers, and she was one of the sort of principal, get out there and do your duty people who went on the stage and told men to sign up. And there would be recruiting clerks outside the theatres to, take down the names and off you go.
It works both ways.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But I'm fascinated to hear more about that sort of that range of comedy, that breadth of comedy. But I think when we're doing Horrible Histories, obviously you're doing it for children. And it's a real knockabout type of comedy. It's sketch, it's absurdist, it's very Python-esque. Our touchstones when we made that show, were Python and Blackadder were our kind of, those are the sort of comedy kind of lightning rods that we would touch when we were writing. We were looking to try and do that for a new generation, but factually sourced. And it's a very pantomimic thing. You're not going to show blood. We don't show guts. We do show violence. We do show, severed limbs and all sorts of things. It's not nice. It's called Horrible Histories, and people sometimes will say, oh, it's a bit nasty. It's like, yeah, that's the point. But I think if you watch, certainly, your listeners to your podcast, if they're curious, they've never seen it, there is a World War I special that you can watch on iPlayer. It's cool. I think it's series 5, and you can just type in Horrible Histories, First World War, and you'll see a World War I special, which was actually a compilation of all the sketches we'd done variously from different series up to that point, sort of packaged together into something resembling a kind of narrative. And you'll see that there's just a real kid gloves approach to the comedy, that there's a lot more gentleness, warmth. We really dial down the kind of brutality, the violence. There's a sketch about the Christmas truce football match, which is slightly mythologized. Obviously, I know historians sometimes sort of say, well, this one's been blown out of proportion a bit. But obviously, the idea of enemies playing football together and potentially not wanting to go back to shooting each other the next day is a really interesting humanizing moment. And we played that not for laughs, really. You know, there's some obvious jokes about, you know, people complaining it's offside or whatever, and someone shouting shoot, and someone saying that's the wrong choice of phrase in the middle of a war. You know, it's your through on goal. Shoot! No, don't say shoot. Say kick. But at the end of it, the sketch, sort of in tribute to Blackadder Goes Forth, doesn't resolve with a kind of big hilarious punchline. It resolves with everyone shaking hands and saying Merry Christmas. You can sort of get away with a slightly more sentimental approach because it felt necessary. It didn't feel like we could go bombastically around with our sense of humour that we'd normally deploy for the 18th century, or the Romans. We would absolutely gone way harder on the kind of cruelty of violence, but you know, it doesn't feel right.
In regards to that, having just had your 42nd birthday, there's only a year's difference of age between me and you. Did you read the Horrible History books when you were younger?
No, I missed them. They came out in 93, 94?
Yeah.
I probably just missed them by maybe a year or two. I was aware of them. Obviously, they were kind of, you know, enormous phenomenon. They'd sold like 20 million copies, and I was completely like appreciative of their scale and impact, but they weren't formative for me. I grew up on Asterix. Like so many historians I know, I grew up on the Asterix books.
Which I can't get my daughter interested in.
They're very specific. They really appeal to a certain subset of nerd because they're so full of puns. And I adore a pun. I'm all about pun. And also I'm half French, so I grew up on them kind of as a cultural trope of like, well, this is my culture. But also I adore the linguistic wordplay. And of course, suddenly you grow up and you realize, hang on a minute, there are different jokes in the French version. Oh, right. Oh, they've completely, you know, half the jokes don't even, you know, most of the jokes have to be rewritten. They don't translate at all. So half of the names of the characters are not funny in English. So they had to give them new character names. That's a really interesting example of where comedy doesn't travel. And yet there's a universality to it, which does travel. The concept of it is funny. You can't pun from French into English that easily because puns are so specific to the idiom. So they had to just come up with new jokes, which is amazing. As a kid, I didn't really realize that until I read the French ones. But the Horrible Histories books were they're absolute phenomenon, and they still sell in huge numbers. And of course, the TV show, I think, has helped perpetuate that. Probably.
TV show lends itself to be YouTuberized because you can get the short sketches.
Yeah, of course. It's a really different medium. When I sort of said that, you know, we had to invent a new genre of TV, I'm not kidding. There's no such thing as specialist factual sketch comedy. It just did not exist, and we had to invent all sorts of aspects to it, including, of course, we needed Rattus. And Rattus is the thing I'm proudest of because Rattus is a historian. He functions as footnotes, and no one's ever done footnotes on TV before for kids.
I'm not sure it's possible to do footnotes on TV for adults. And Rattus is definitely more effective than most of the ones that people have tried.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. But with Rattus, he'd be up there in the corner with a little sign saying true, or this bit's silly, or don't trust this. And then at the end, he would confirm and deny.
Angus and I both have children who are the Horrible Histories generation. And this is how my children learned history. And they cite Rattus.
And he's sort of based on me. He's an annoying hairy pedant with bad jokes. It took us a while to figure out that we needed him. You know, we showed a couple of sketches to kids in a local school, and they just didn't get it. They were like really baffled, and they didn't know which bits to trust. And the really surprising thing about Horrible Histories is obviously the weirdest and wildest facts were the true things, and the jokes that we would put alongside were kind of us just sort of like jollying it up. They just thought that the weird, wild, true things were the jokes because they couldn't believe that they were true. And we went, we've got a weird problem here. Our raw material is so unbelievable that kids don't trust it. But this is the factual information, and we need to find a way of confirming this bit's true. And so we needed a historian. And so Rattus is this really extraordinary device who is there literally in the middle of the comedy going, yup, nope, yup, mate. And then at the end going, all right, okay, so there's two versions of this story, and we told you the funnier version, but the second version says that actually didn't really happen like that. So there was a really interesting kind of epistemological crisis happening for kids watching the show who were like, I don't know what to trust. And that's really interesting because that teaches you so quickly the rhythms of comedy. By definition, the rhythms of comedy lean you towards not expecting exaggeration, right? When we hear a gag, when we hear a story, a tall tale, a shaggy dog story, we know there's embellishment because that is the trope. That is what comedy is. It's an embellishment of something. And even if you read a funny story online, even if someone's sort of posted a kind of anecdote on Twitter and they're sort of threaded it and it's like, here's a story that happened to me one time. In our heads, we're going, yeah, but you've probably smoothed that out and you've probably added in this and you've rearranged the order and the punchline's a bit funnier than really happened because we know that. And then the problem is if you show that to kids, they go, yeah, you're making this up, right? And you go, no, that bit's true. That bit's true. So we needed someone to anchor it. And that's what's really interesting about Horrible Histories is that it was, I guess, kids' first experience of historiographical tension.
I'm currently writing a introductory lecture for our first years on historiography, and I'm now going to include Radis. So thank you.
Yes, he's up there. Yeah, von Ranke, Rattus, Carlyle, the kind of the greats.
When I was first teaching during my PhD, which must have been 2009, 2010 time, the students then had been watching Horrible Histories, and they knew the songs off by heart and the like. And there was a real. I mean, you only need to spend about 5 minutes teaching undergraduates to realise that you are not part of there's a generational gap going on, and you can measure it in Simpsons jokes. In that they were talking about, oh yeah, we got this song from Horrible Histories, and I thought they were talking about the book, but they were no, we watched it on TV during college, and they're like, well, I wasn't watching it on TV during college because I was at university, and even there was a time gap and the like. But looking at the dates of the Horrible History books and thinking about what you were saying about like the 100-year window, it's not exactly the same, but it takes ages before they touch the 20th century in the Horrible History books. It's like 5, 6, 7 years in before they go anywhere near the First World War, the Second World War. There's a lot of other history that you can talk about.
But that's something I'm also now encountering myself as now the author of children's books. I've just launched my own series of children's books called Totally Chaotic History. Again, sort of the idea is to be comedic and funny, but also I'm co-writing them with experts. Again, everything I do in my career, I'm trying to be working with academics. And book 1, Ancient Egypt. Book 2, Roman Britain. Book 3, the Stone Age. Book 4, the Greeks. I am in the ancient world and I'm starting there. And to a certain extent, because that's how the curriculum is designed. So I'm trying to reinforce the curriculum. There's also a sort of temporal logic to start at the beginning. There's an argument to say you can't really understand the First World War without really getting your head around so many of the kind of everything else, right? So many of the institutions, so many of the concepts. I mean, the idea of empire, the idea of technology, the idea of like borders. This is ours, that's yours. The idea of mass mobilization, the concept of Europe as an idea, right? Or nation states. You've got to start with the Romans and you've got to start, and you need to sort of go, all right, but let's talk about the modernization of the army in the 17th century. Let's talk about the introduction of the flintlock musket. Those sort of American Hollywood dramas are like previously on Homeland. You need like your introductory voiceover would be so long before you can say previously on First World War. So I think there's a reason you don't start with the World Wars. And it's an interesting challenge because, it's really hard to be funny about them without being like, oh, sorry, this is sensitive territory. But also there is this sense that the curriculum, the way we teach history, you start with the furthest away. You start with an exoticism of the ancient world. You start with the Egyptians, who are beautiful and shiny and weird and alien and glamorous. And there's 3,200 years of it. And you kind of go, ooh, mummies, pyramids, sand. And it's a very aesthetically and intellectually stimulating way into the story for young kids. And the First World War is a much more traumatic way into the story. I mean, my daughter's 5 and we're desperately trying to keep her from seeing horrors on the news. We don't want her to see horrifying things yet because she's not quite ready yet to know about these things. But of course, she's going to have to be soon. She's going to have to encounter the world and hear about horrors and wars.
And yet we are happy to give our children Asterix and the Legionaries and, because the Roman Empire in its way was violent and traumatic and brutal. I'm sort of circling back to that point you make about the 100-year cutoff, because of course for the First World War we've just come through that 100-year cutoff, right? We're moving out of memory into history, and for those of us working in the field, that's a really interesting point in terms of how we talk about it, how we teach it. And the history of memory of the First World War is its own subfield, of course. I'm really interested in that distinction, because I'm wondering if for our field in particular, we're at a turning point in how we can represent it in popular culture, how it will be represented in popular culture, and if it'll start becoming funnier over the second half of my career, as opposed to the sentimentality of the first half.
A few years ago, there was the Peter Jackson film, They Shall Not Go Old, and I was sort of was loosely associated with that a little bit, and I think we chatted about it online a little bit at the time. I was sort of helping to just talk about it in the public space, and I sort of at the time said overtly, look, I'm not a World War I scholar here, but I think I sort of wanted to sort of speak about what the film was trying to do and achieve, and whether it was successful or not is up for people to decide. But what was so powerful for people was the use of technology to colorize in more than a sort of technical sense, by switching it out, by improving the audio, by improving the kind of image sharpness, and then putting in color. A huge number of people just went, wow, they were like me. And you realize that the First World War had been sort of technologically distanced from us by the kind of by dint of being black and white. And for a whole generation of people, black and white feels like a different landscape or a different world. And the moment you put it into color, although that is controversial, although some people would say, no, that's, you're meddling, or you're not, there shouldn't need to be that level of intervention to care about human life. We should be able to appreciate that these were human beings being blown up and going to war for their country. There is something profound and moving about suddenly seeing these 17-year-old lads in color, giggling, laughing, training, hitting each other with sandbags or whatever it is, pillow fights, and then suddenly you see them age rapidly as they are hurled into the trenches and the fatigue and the exhaustion and the cold and the wet and the mud, and then you catch that same man 2 years later and he looks harrowed, and you think, oh my God, he's aged 10 years in 2 years. There was something about that film that touched people in a way that I've never seen any other project do, and it was the opposite of comedy. I think we'd agree, right? There's not many laughs in that. The really interesting thing is we then got the movie 1917. Again, no laughs in that. Another technological achievement in that it's a sort of one shot. Well, obviously it's not, but it's designed to look like one long shot. So it's meant to be like a kind of exhausting video game style. Like, I can't think what the technical term is, but like
point of view, first person.
Yeah, exactly. But it feels very video gamey to me. And then, of course, we've had a few sort of European films, art house films, whatever, but we haven't really had any kind of big comedic.
It's as if Blackadder has swallowed First World War comedy, and nobody can do anything with it.
We're so used to America setting the agenda. We're so used to the States going, yeah, don't worry, we've got this. And they don't touch the First World War, even though they were involved. Like, militarily, they were involved for a good year. It's not it doesn't feel part of their palette. And obviously Hollywood doesn't throw money behind it, because they're like, well, they've got World War II, which is their sort of great heroic patriotic narrative. They've got Nam, which is obviously the kind of like, oh, this did not go well. And then they've got kind of Korea, which they sort of approach gently and go, we're not sure what to do with that. And that Korea obviously gave us one of the great comedies in MASH, but it's also been used by things like Mad Men as a point of shame and awkwardness. Mad Men, Don Draper serves in Korea, takes another man's identity, and then starts a new life. And it's this sort of constant like thing for him where he's hiding, right? And the Korean War sort of gets hidden. It's an interesting analogy. But the First World War, Hollywood just is not interested. And Blackadder is so parochially British. I don't know if the French watch Blackadder. I don't know if the Germans might, because the Germans like British humour, but I don't know if Blackadder travels. I don't know if it's an international hit.
I mean, I encountered Blackadder growing up in the States, but then I had a British mother. So I'm not a particularly good example of.
And where did you grow up in the States? Are you East Coast?
I grew up in New York.
Yeah. So Horrible Histories played in the States, East Coast, West Coast, but we could not get it screened in the Midwest or in no one in Ohio saw Horrible Histories. It won an Emmy Award, which was very exciting. For a British little low budget TV kids show to win an Emmy Award was really exciting. But when I teach master's students, quite often they're American and Canadian, and they come over and I get them to write a Horrible History sketch and perform it. and they have to watch Horrible Histories first, and they are often horrified, and they're like, "How is this for kids? How is this appropriate for 8-year-olds?" And we're like, "Yeah, in the UK, this is how we treat the past, right? It's irreverent. We have an intellectual tradition of being funny about our leaders and taking the piss out of our kings and queens and mocking power. You know, we don't dignify our betters with comedy. We go after them." And also with Horrible Histories, we're doing violence and gore and slapstick and poo. And the American students they're often startled by it. There was briefly a moment where an American network wanted to do a Horrible Histories USA, and they asked us to write some sketches, and we wrote the sketches, and they just sort of sent a one-line email back going like, "No way." You know, they were like, what is this? And we're like, "Well, you asked us to do some sketches for you." And they're like, "This is for children." You're like, "Yep. Yeah, it's for children."
Weirdly, the closest I think the Americans come is Dr. Seuss. And this popped up, things you learned via Twitter, actually, weirdly, was someone was posting a whole lot of Dr. Seuss cartoons, standalone cartoons from the 1930s when he was profoundly against the America First. He's so satirizing the America First. But of course, he is a children's author. He's using all the comedy tropes. They are profoundly satirical. They're really, really funny. But that's the closest to mocking, to that sort of political satire that might be appropriate for children that I can think of in the American tradition.
The Simpsons does it well at times. The Simpsons, they've skewered a number of American presidents, and they've done funny stuff about the two world wars at times, generally through Abe Simpson and the like.
But The Simpsons obviously was radical at the time. It was meant to be subversive. It ended up as such a staple that it's no longer subversive because it was just sort of on TV. You just sort of watch it and go, "Oh yeah, The Simpsons." But of course, when you first saw it, it was incredibly. I'm trying to remember if Dr. Seuss served in a world war. I in my head, I think he might have been a serviceman who saw.
I don't know. I will now have to go follow that up because that's really interesting.
Well, that's not Schultz, is it? Is it?
No. Charles Schultz is Peanuts, who of course uses the First World War because of the Red Baron, but it's the heroic image of the war, which is very much where the US understands the war. It was, a European tragedy, an American heroic endeavor.
You're right. The Red Baron, the Baron von Richthofen, and sort of Snoopy, sort of always being sort of his little dog shed being gunned, machine gun bullets down the side, which to me always felt like a surrealist trope. Because I loved those books as a kid. I found them really interesting because there was so much verisimilitude in the other sketches, but Snoopy lived in his own little world where there were bullet holes in his doghouse, and you're like, hang on a second, is he at war with the Red? Is he sort of slipping into 1915?
He's playing with the power of literature, I think, because he writes these adventure novels, doesn't he? It is his imagination that takes you in.
As a kid, I loved the Biggles books. I was really into the Biggles books, which I guess was something very similar. It's very colonial. It's very kind of like, hooray! Put on the old goggles and daring do, jump in the Sopwith Camel and go and shoot Jerry. But it's very interesting to me that comedically, the First World War feels either dangerous territory, no one wants to touch it, or potentially it's that people don't connect to it. I said something a few years ago that was quite controversial, and I sort of said it almost as a bit of just to see what people would say. But I said, I wonder if the First World War will become the New Boer War. But there was an enormous amount of commemorative anniversary content. There was the Danny Boyle stuff. There was a sort of huge national agreement that 100 years was very, very important, that we should all mark it. But I was curious whether 10 years later, the First World War would just slip out of public consciousness and would no longer be a national moment that required the ongoing commemoration, much like the Boer War has slipped out. If you talk to people what the Boer War is, if you say to anyone on the street, tell me about the Boer War, they can't,
My second year module this year is looking at the Boer War, First World War, Second World War, and my first lecture is, this is what the Boer War was, because I do not assume that my students will know.
And that's not to say the Boer War was anywhere near as large, of course, as the First World War, which is, was an incredibly apocalyptic global conflict, and it's the downfall of huge empires and all sorts of things. I'm not comparing the size and scale and impact of them, but I'm just really interested whether there is a very boring temporal rule where once something has slipped, you've done your 100 years, you've done your centenary, everyone has put up their they've done their art projects. You've put up all your statues and monuments. You've done your big kind of historical recreations on the beach. People have worn the uniforms. They've put it all away. They've moved on. What then? I'm just sort of interested. Obviously France has the Franco-Prussian War, 1870s. That's an interesting one because 150 years came and went, and there wasn't that much. They sort of went, yeah, but again, that's a sort of shame.
Is that too diverse, politically diversive, though?
It might be a shame thing, right? It's not very, you don't necessarily want, the problem for France, of course, is they keep getting invaded and they don't really want to talk about this stuff. It's
slightly difficult as part of the European Union to talk about the Franco-Prussian War because the whole point is we're friends now after 150 years of fighting.
I mean, you can invite Angela Merkel along to sort of see your, go, we're all friends now, but, But that to me is intriguing. And I think obviously World War II, I would say, and I hope this is not a controversial take. I mean, Angus, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but I would say World War II has started to lose its power in the kind of historic memory world of like publishing and filmmaking. I think there are fewer projects, books, movies. I mean, I'm not saying there are not. Of course, they're not. But I think it's losing it.
I would suggest it's shifted. We're not getting the massive amount of films coming out, are we, that we used to get? There is partly there's not the massive amount of documentaries that come out, but that partly is to do with there's less places to distribute them. But that said, when you get to the sort of podcasting YouTube, there is huge interest still, but that might be because it's international interest, which hides the fact that any one country doesn't have necessarily enough interest to sustain it.
It was very noticeable in the weirdly, and this is a chronological coincidence in the lead up to the centenary, that a lot of computer game developers abandoned the Second World War because there was nothing left to say about it. You can only do Saving Private Ryan or Enemy at the Gates so many times, and some of the games went into the far future, and that's how you end up with a game with Jon Snow, actor in space. And some of them went backwards to try and find another historical setting to set their first-person shooters in, and they discovered the First World War to put them in there. But the interest in Second World War computer games dropped off a cliff in the lead up to the centenary.
So as a TV maker before I became whatever I am now, there was a reason we did so many documentaries about World War II, and that's that you could get the footage for free from the Library of Congress from the USA. It was extremely expensive when you needed to get it from the IWM. So if you were making a documentary about Britain during World War II, your first port of call was Washington, D.C. You'd go to a place called Footage Farm, and they would sell you this footage for about 250 quid per tape, essentially. You'd get a tape worth of footage of stuff, and you'd hope to be getting newsreel footage that Pathé had shot to show in the States so that, Roosevelt could sort of convince people to come and help out. And you would be then buying that, and then you'd own it, and you'd then be able to use it in your documentary. Whereas if you wanted to license footage from Imperial War Museum, you're paying thousands of pounds to show, hurricanes and Spitfires in the air above London and bombed out Coventry and people training to throw grenades or whatever from sandbags. So there was a really interesting thing that structurally there was a massive budgetary crisis the moment you were trying to make a documentary about World War II if your footage was British. And so I've always been curious as to whether the internationalism, but also the copyright situation for First and Second World War footage leads filmmakers down that path. I've always been curious whether it's actually the vast amount of material, but also the fact it's free or cheap means people keep returning to it because they're like, well, we can make this, we can make it cheap, but we can't make that because that's expensive, and we can't do this because, so it's also a question of does technology and availability shape the stories we tell?
I think that's absolutely true.
But that perhaps is the freedom of moving away from television, where you can only do something that's visual. So when you move to the audio, and apparently when you move to the sort of more international podcast sort of view of it, I find I can do topics that are not traditional Second World War topics, or like this, not traditional First World War topics that find an audience that wouldn't necessarily be a mainstream audience, but actually get quite a lot of, my favourite episode of the Second World War I've ever discussed is cork and the Second World War, because cork only comes from Spain and Portugal, which are both neutral countries, and everybody needs cork for engines and sails, and there's a huge espionage thing going on of who's buying what cork. It's a corner of the war that no one ever knows about, but actually when you start to introduce people to go, that's really interesting.
Yeah. You should do a podcast called Cork Talk.
I thought this was going to be about the place in Ireland when Angus started.
But they're topics when you get onto these more international ways of pushing out media that get covered on places like YouTube.
You're right. But also, I think, what's really interesting, and funny you mentioned cork, because my brain immediately went to the Spanish Armada, right? And Francis Drake attacking the cork factories. So again, it's still really important. And also as a historian one of the reasons that champagne becomes a luxurious, glamorous drink is because the technology of glass is stronger in England in the 17th century than it is in France. And so the pressure of the champagne bottles, they explode in France. And so the glass isn't strong enough, but sea coal is used in Britain at the time or England at the time. And so they've got stronger bottles so they can withstand, which means you get fizzy wine. And so champagne is an English invention by accident. It's French wine, but it's the English glass that allows it to happen. And again, the cork going in the top builds up the pressure. If your glass is strong enough, suddenly you've got this glamorous new drink. So things like cork are fascinating. I love the history of ordinary, boring, small little things that turn out to be really important, the history of the tin can and that kind of thing. But with World War II, I think what's really interesting is when you look at the people making those huge, huge stories, it's still Spielberg and Hanks. And they are getting quite old, and it's their dad's generation stories they keep telling. Spielberg is telling stories from his youth. Hanks is telling his dad's stories. The Greyhound movie, Masters of the Air. But when they go, who's telling those stories?
The same's true in fiction, because you had Regeneration, which was written by a woman who grew up with a First World War veteran. You had Sebastian Faulks, but our generation won't be writing those sort of memory-infused histories. And this is something that Michael Roper's been working on, from how do we write histories as historians in this process of moving away from memory and oral, the collections of the oral histories and the like. So I think for both world wars we're at a really interesting point as historians, but as public historians as well.
And obviously you've got Taika Waititi doing a comedy about Hitler a few years ago, and people were so split on that. It was so divisive, that movie. It was, some people loved it, some people loathed it with a fiery passion. That's a really interesting, provocative story, right? Hitler is a sort of an imaginary character in a child's mind as an analogy to the way in which demagoguery works in society, and that people can be radicalized by horrific ideas. And then you play it for laughs, but you don't really play it for laughs. You play it for laughs for a bit, and then you actually quietly reveal the horror. It's a really interesting film, but some people were appalled by it. And so that's interesting, is that to do comedy about World War I, World War II, you really do risk a kind of tightrope effect. You can fall off that tightrope really easily. And there's elements of Tarantino, even in his Inglourious Bastards, there's gags in there, but they're really bad taste gags.
I always thought of Inglourious Bastards, it's very interesting. Tarantino's approaches these films in the way, but that Hitler gets killed and basically the Nazis get destroyed in a cinema is clearly a commentary on Second World War films and the very nature of them itself.
And I mean, that Brad Pitt tank movie, Fury, sort of an interesting film, isn't it? Because when you look at it now, we're seeing tank battles again. We're seeing horrifying tank battles in Ukraine, and the horror is sort of reanimated again, because now you're seeing burned out tanks, and you're seeing the horrors of these modern cameras capturing what happens when the drone hits the tank in real time in HD quality, and you know there are humans inside. And to then watch a movie in hindsight kind of changes the equation a bit. And so I don't know, I'm really curious whether comedy can land with the First and Second World War in the same way it can land with any other kind of period of history, because I feel like there's echoes happening now in the modern world that keep resensitizing, if that makes sense. Like I feel like even though they're slipping out of, we're losing the centenary, we're losing that, there's still essentially wars in which civilians were shelled, buildings collapsed, towns were destroyed, tanks blew up, planes were shot out of the sky. It feels very modern.
And there's a pressure, certainly on British academic historians, to be impactful, to show why our work is relevant. And one of those relevances can be to say, look, there are echoes. I know that's true of my work, looking at disabled ex-servicemen and then reading articles about rehabilitation in Ukraine of servicemen being recycled through the military in very, very similar ways to the way you could see in the First World War, which is, I think we always have to be careful. It was historian Michael Howard who said, there are no lessons of history. You don't just learn something from what happened in the past in that quite that way. But I think hearing those echoes, which is something that public historians can sort of bring attention to, is something that we need to do more of, even if it does mean we lose some of the funny in there.
For my sins, on You're Dead to Me, we have a rule: no Tudors, no World War II. And that's a sort of personal policy, in that I'm absolutely sick of the Tudors and I'm absolutely sick of World War II. But but it's not to say they're not important or interesting. Of course they are. They are, by definition, they're fascinating. We are obsessed with the Tudors, and we were obsessed with World War II. We've never done World War One either. I'm wondering why we haven't. I guess maybe, my colleagues are women. My colleagues have particular interests. Perhaps none of us we're not particularly drawn to military history, any of us. And maybe none of us feel like that's a natural fit for our, Emmy's a medievalist, Emma is a biblical scholar. We tend to work on social history, cultural history. We tend to be more. There's
lots of women, lots of social and cultural history of the war.
Of course there is. But I think maybe our default instinct is just, well, we don't really do wars. We don't really do wars on the podcast. And then there's the question of like comedy and sensitivity and so on. But I think maybe Emmy and I, if we chatted about it, we'd find lots that we'd find interesting in there. But maybe our just instinct is just go, well, there's loads of other stuff we can do. And also, for me, World War II just got so much coverage when I was training as a historian, when I was making TV documentaries. The running joke was the History Channel was called the Hitler Channel, because it was just wall-to-wall documentaries about Churchill and Hitler. And you could find a World War II you could turn on the TV at any time of day and there would be a documentary about World War II. But now maybe that's not true anymore. And maybe I need to update I'm not updating my Tudor thing. The Tudors are bloody everywhere.
Not until 6 goes out of the West End, at any rate.
Yeah, well, 6 is great. It's fab. It's wonderful. But, there's a movie in the cinemas right now about, Henry VIII's wife. And you're just going to go, all right, get over it. World War II, maybe not.
When I was studying, we used to joke about Tudor kings and Nazi sharks being the staple of TV history.
I did a lecture a few years ago at York University where I asked the graphic designer buddy of mine to design a kind of ridiculous poster for the ideal Channel 5 documentary. I was being very facetious about Channel 5 do lots of very good stuff, but it was The Secrets of the Nazi Tudor Shark on the Moon with the Titanic in the background. And it was...
Yeah, with some aliens thrown in.
Aliens, JFK, the Titanic, Nazis, Churchill, all the things you just desperately want to know about. You just stick them all in one documentary and I was being silly, but there are certain subjects that gets made over and over and over and over on TV. There are certain subjects that in publishing will sell over and over and over. There are certain subjects that YouTube will do much better on. And if you do a podcast episode about them, people will switch in and they'll tune in way more than it would, if you were going to do something on West African history of the 18th century or whatever, which might be really interesting, but people might be like, nah, not for me. Thanks very much. What have you got about, the home front in Spitfire? Yeah, I want to know. Tell me more about HMS Hood. Don't know why that came to mind. Something bubbled up in my brain there.
Let's say you've got like a burning Bismarck thing going on at the moment.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? The Bismarck. I reckon if you go into the streets and you grab anyone under 40 and say, "Tell me about Bismarck," I don't think they're bringing up the battleship. I think nothing registers there. And I grew up knowing so much about Bismarck, not through trying, just it was in the ether. Everyone knew about the sinking of the Bismarck. Way more than the actual man Bismarck.
Various Star Wars novels did the sinking of the Bismarck. Just reproduced it in space.
Yeah, it's such an interesting trope. So, yeah, I don't know. So, coming to things as a historian who does humour, the First World and Second World War have always been for me territory that I gingerly tread over. If I have to, I will. But if I choose to do a subject, I probably am not choosing it. And also, I don't feel trained in the field. I'm really aware of my lack of knowledge. I'm really aware there are much better scholars than me. And so I always feel like, oh, this isn't necessary. I don't need to do this. I'm not the right person for it. I'm going to back out. And that perhaps is a flaw of mine. Maybe I'm being a coward about it, but I'm curious whether you feel there's
Every time I listen to You're Dead to Me, I think, how could you do a First World War subject?
Oh yeah, come on, yeah, let's have it.
No, I haven't got. Well, you tend to start You're Dead to Me with an individual to hang all those interesting stories on, and I'm sort of going, who would be my or what would be my pitch? I'm not sure. Sort of limbless ex-serviceman is a particularly good pitch for You're Dead to Me podcast.
But we've done histories of disability. There's ways in. It's sort of, I'm trying to think of the first ever sketch we ever did about World War One on Horrible Histories was the causes of the First World War, and it's written by Steve Punt. It was all these army officers around a table. And the idea was that we treat them like schoolboys, and the sort of brigadier general is trying to explain why Britain is going to war, and the kids don't understand. And it's all to do with, well, if your friend punched this guy in the playground, you'd step in and you'd punch him, wouldn't you? And then his friend would step in and punch you, and then his friend would step in to defend him when you stepped in to defend your friend, and then we'd all be, and it's the absurdity of if one person does one thing, everyone else has to pile in. And for 8-year-olds, you're trying to explain, well, why does an assassination in Serbia necessitate vast diplomatic failure and then military action from these huge nations hundreds of thousands of miles away? How on earth does America end up in this war? There's all these sort of like, what? Hang on, what? But it's so complicated, and it's so.
Although it does lend itself to humour, because we went to see Over the Lovely War, the touring production that was it was in Leeds a couple of months ago, and they have a scene which is similar, satirical, trying to explain exactly the same thing, which is very, very funny. I'm going to keep trying to think of what the First World War equivalent of the history of Cork in the war is, and then I'll text you. I'll send you a message, Greg, when I do.
Cork talk. Let's all do Cork talk. There are so many misnomers about the First World War, of course, which you know way better than I do. And I think one of the ones was really interesting is just like the number of men who did come back alive. I think so many people, it's like the ratios, right? I mean, the number of men who went out and served and came back, really high, because I think we assume
it's what my next book is about. So yeah, it's what I'm writing on at the moment. So yeah, if you ever do decide to do anything, either if you want the men who didn't go, talk to Angus. If you want the men who came back, talk to me.
That's the Men Who Came Back is a good name. Yeah, obviously, of course, there are so many misnomers, myths, urban legends, misunderstandings about the First World War and indeed the Second World War. Of course, you can talk about it extensively. As I say, I just feel I'm very much not a historian of the 20th century. It's a deliberate choice, and it's also, I feel like there are just better people doing it, and I never felt like I needed to do it because my whole thing was about trying to get people to look at other subjects that weren't covered. But there comes a point where maybe I need to be doing this stuff as well, just because it's important, it's interesting. But yeah, it's very intriguing. And as someone who comes to things with a comedic eye, I'm always wondering, well, how do you do that? Funny? Do you need to make it funny? Are you just forcing funny onto something that just doesn't fit? It just doesn't work, right? And on the Horrible Histories, of course, we never did the Holocaust. Of course, we didn't. But there were times where I'd sit there going, well, look, millions of people were deliberately exterminated by a sort of horrific regime. We should probably mention that. But like, where, how, what is your way in comedically, or even if you do it completely straight? It's so traumatic, it's so horrifying, and it feels so inappropriate when you are then bookending it with here's a funny sketch over here, here's a funny sketch over here, and in the middle you just go, by the way, kids, Auschwitz. It just feels wildly unsuited to a comedy show about the past. And so we didn't do it. But I, having lost family members in Auschwitz, and indeed a family member survived Auschwitz, I always sort of felt like, oh God, I really should find a way into this. But there just isn't, right? What is your funny route? It's
the peculiar thing is the school curriculum doesn't shy away with it. As an 8-year-old, my daughter was doing Anne Frank at school.
There's lots of fantastic children's literature about the Holocaust. Is it Judith Kerr when Hitler stole Pink Rabbit, which is what I grew up on. really beautifully done.
Even The Tiger That Came to Tea, people have often sort of said, look, this is clearly a book about something. It's not just about tigers. I always feel like comedy needs to be an appropriate approach. I'm not going to just put absolutely everything into the kind of comedy meat grinder and go, well, come on, it's all history, it's all valid. You have to make a tone judgment. You've got to make the right sensitivity. And it's also about who's telling these stories, who are our guests, who's listening, what effect will it have on the listener? Will you horrify and upset people more than delight and amuse and entertain or intrigue them? I don't ever want You're Dead to Me to be harrowing, and I never want someone to listen to it and come away going, I wish I hadn't listened. Comedy is a state of mind as well as an approach, and sometimes people switch into You're Dead to Me for a laugh. It's Friday, they've had a long week, they want something to cheer them up or to take them away from their cares and their concerns, and they don't really want to hear necessarily something bleak. So sometimes it just doesn't work.
Is that perhaps a good place to leave it? Greg, thank you for your time. Folks, we'll be back next month. I'm not sure what our diary secretary has planned, but I'm sure it would be a surprise to us all.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I've got planned either.
All right, guys. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.